Hello again, Steve. It's good to see you again. Just to recap again, like we did in the previous session, we actually covered how the solutions focused coaching approach works in an individual setting. Now, as we stated earlier, we actually said that solutions focused approach could be used in many settings, something like project management, strategic planning. It can be used in teaching coaching leadership skills, and it can also be utilised in team building and organisational change. And I'm going to lay out a sort of a scenario now which we can actually discuss and try and help out with. And somebody as a team leader within an organisation is leading the team, and they've set some ambitious goals, or the organisation have set some ambitious goals. And what the team leaders have been tasked with is trying to create motivation through various things, because what's happening at the moment with the pressure of change that's being thrust upon them is noticing conflicts and tensions between team members and between other departments. And actually being faced with the process of change is that challenge. And so what we need to do is look at those things in terms of what the pressure of the new project is, and how we can actually now, through the solutions focused approach, empower the team to give them more responsibility, more accountability, and we're looking for a set of working principles that will enable them to do that.
And I guess it's thinking back to the previous programs that, as you say, solution focused conversations can take place anywhere that people are having a conversation. So we have the organisational perspective, we've got the therapy model that we'll talk about in the next program. I guess within one of the things to look at here is that a team is made up of individual members, and by working with those individual members as parts of the team, we can help things to move forward. So I guess one of the first things that we, either or both of us working with that team, would be looking at the preferred future. What does the organisation want, and what do the individual members want? And I'm just thinking about the model that you were discussing earlier about the glass half full, the glass half empty. Would you start with the half full glass and identifying what makes it half full when you're talking to this team? Would that be a good starting point?
I think it would. I think it really would be a good starting point. And what I would tend to do is, if it is any number in the team, would actually get a team together and hold a workshop, and then say, well, these are the goals and these are the outcomes that the organisation want. What we'll be looking at is, first of all, what's working well within the organisation despite the change. The goals have already been outlined by the organisation, so we want to know basically what is working well, and then look at the resources through that, and basically maybe set up a workshop and split the workshop into groups of 2 or 3 and do various exercises with them to actually assess what's working well within the department, and also then to actually start having a look at the resources and how the resources are actually utilised within that.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, and it can be a fantastic eye-opener for people when they're turning up for a workshop, as you say, which is looking at change, which people generally don't like very much, particularly if it's an unpopular change like more productivity, less waste. Things like this almost always strike fear into people's hearts. So they're turning up with a sense of negative anticipation, if you like. So starting the day with small groups, looking at what works well, what the resources are, this idea that Mark McCurgow and Paul Z. Jackson came up with, what's the platform, what's the foundation of the organisation, and the foundation's built on the resources that they've got in terms of the people and the things that they do right. So I think that can be a pleasant surprise for people when they turn up for workshops.
The thing that I actually remember, an approach that I picked up from Paul Jackson and Janine Waldman when I actually was on their training course, was the fact that they told me a story about a company, I think it was a telecommunications company, that went through a really bad crisis, and after the crisis was over, as in lots of organisations, they had a meeting, and they were actually expecting, must have been about 50 within the meeting itself. The head of the department came along, and normally within meetings they say you usually come up with the phrase, what went wrong, what's the problem, why did it go wrong, and this head manager or head director come up with it, and he'd only earlier on in the year had actually done solutions focused coaching or solutions focused training, and he actually astounded them, asking the question, what went well, what's working well, despite the problem, despite the crisis. And that really got me thinking and say, yeah, well, that's a good idea. It opens up communications, and they tackled it from that point. So from there, it just shows you how one approach itself can in some ways change the mindset and change people's thinking and give them ideas. And they went through the workshop and they came out with 20, 30 different ideas on what they needed to do. After just that one question, they focused on ideas that was working well, what could they do more of. Because as a rugby player, it was basically, with me, it was actually going and being and as a coach, it was building on your strengths. What are the strengths in the organisation? You don't build something on weaknesses. The weaknesses in some ways are still there. However, when you're building on the strengths, and those strengths are actually taking you forward, that is probably the best way of doing it. What's functioning well? And it's like any member of a team, or any captain of a team, or coach of a team has to pick the team. Does he pick his team built on his weakest players, or does he actually build it on his strengths? And I actually think, because it's a strength-based approach, in some ways it's a strength-based approach, but it's based on what's functioning well.
I think you're right, and certainly with teams and organisations I've worked with, what I've found is if you work on the competence, work on the strengths, work on that principle that we've discussed of doing more of what works well, what tends to happen is that the weaknesses are displayed, because whether it be an individual or whether it be part of a system or part of the organisation, that weakness is as I say, displaced by the strengths part of it. So a good, someone that I worked with in Shetland when I did some work up there said, we haven't got time to do things wrong because we're doing so much more well. And that really made me think, and talking to the team that he was part of, they were spending so much time thinking about and working on what they did well and doing better, that they simply didn't have time to do things wrong. And I found that a really powerful message. I guess the other thing I was thinking about when we're talking about teams, I mean that could be a single team with an organisation, or it could be a whole organisation, I guess.
Now, if we're just going on a team theory, it's specifically in team sports, then you get players sent off. And I do feel quite strongly that when somebody, or when there are people missing from a team, as in football, at 10 against 11, that they actually tighten up the hatches. They actually then really play to the strengths that they have. And I can relate this to an historical incident of which I, as I said earlier, we played 26 years of rugby and coached it. We were actually playing in a Royal Air Force Cup match, and our unit was 700 strong, and we didn't have many people to pick from, against previous RF Cup winners whose unit strength was 7,000. And although we didn't have a player sent off, we had a man injured, and there was no substitutes at that point in time in the late 70s. So we were actually winning the game about 16-13, and we really tightened up and played to our strengths. And although we were a man short against the previous cup winners, we actually managed to win the match 25-23. So it does show you, by playing to your strengths, that even a man short, you can alleviate your weaknesses. So now what we want to do is now take it back to sort of the organisational setting.
And I think we mentioned in one of the previous programmes this idea of uncommon sense, so they are in the RAF playing rugby, never heard of the solution focused approach or solution focused practice, and yet you were able to get an historic victory based on playing to your strengths and using the resources that you've got available. And I guess that's one of the appeals of the approach. One of the things that we haven't mentioned previously, I think, is that people in organisations can really engage with this approach because it makes sense to them. You don't have to have a PhD, you don't have to have been to university to understand it or to practice it. And I guess one of the organisations we could think about is local communities, and there have been a lot of examples of people working with local communities. So it's not to say this is just a business model, it can be a community development model as well.
And it's not just, in some ways, it's not just the solutions focused approach that is taken. There is a couple of other models that work well in communities working with solutions focused approach. There's appreciative inquiry, there's also a positive deviance approach, and they work well, and they are actually in some ways a very, very similar model to the solutions focused approach itself. And I actually think the term of engaging, I think, is very, very important. And does that mean management engaging or the employees engage with management? I think the engagement is mutual. And one of the things that we've got to look at in terms of engaging, how do we actually engage? How are employees and management, how can they engage and make the work setting a happy workplace? And there are actually various tools that you can use, and simple tools. We talked about sharing stories of success. We looked at how management can actually appreciate the employee, and by having communication that works, by having a detailed vision, and then because of those things, the change may become easier.
And I think a lot of the exercises, a lot of the development processes that we use with organisations help that. So an organisation may have a vision of what they want to do, they've got their aims and objectives, they've got to satisfy the shareholders very often, and people talk about sign up. How do we get employees, how do we get team members to sign up to these objectives? And this happens with, as I say, community projects, government organisations, private businesses. We've all got shareholders one way or another. One of the things that I've noticed with solution focused practice is that common language. So when we work with a whole organisation, and that could be by having representatives from various departments, or it could be working from one department to the next, but making it really, really inclusive. So some of the organisations I've worked with, we've had the managing director, the chief exec, sitting at a table with the person who cleans their office, and all of the people looking across the pay grade, as it were, all of the people in between, mixing and working together. The most interesting thing is that they all want the same thing. They all want that organisation to be a success, because if it's a success, then they're going to carry on with the job, and these are times where people need to be retaining the jobs. That common language of solution focused practice, where is it you want to go to, where are you now, and what are the tiny steps that will get you there? And I think I've certainly been part of some really humbling experiences where a chief exec has admitted that they've learned so much from their frontline staff, and that they are going to change as a result of that.
That's fine. We are actually short on time, but we've actually, I think, covered the main principles, and as you've probably recognised, that the main principles and tools that we're actually using can actually be used in lots of different settings. So we look forward to listening to us for our next programme.
And that will be about solution focused brief therapy, which is the original idea of solution focused practice.